Life in the trenches. Along the entire length of the front, both warring sides were actively entrenching. The Krieg's trench lines expanded into the rear, a third and fourth line were added, firing points were reinforced, and forward positions significantly strengthened. Gradually, a network of trenches enveloped the Van Mersland wastes. It seemed neither side intended to undertake active operations in the near future. The premature assault by the 143rd Regiment became only the first of countless similar attacks undertaken thereafter. Each regiment would partake in crossing no man's land, and practically each would be repelled. During the 34th Corps offensive on the Saritam Heights, the 308th Regiment managed to secure Hill 204 and valiantly held their positions. The Guardsmen fought for weeks, until repeated enemy counterattacks forced them to retreat. For weeks, the stalemate kept both warring sides tense. But despite the difficult situation, each unit was required to carry out patrol duties and participate in raids on enemy positions. Night operations in no man's land included intercepting patrols, setting up minefields, and searching for suitable passages through thorny brush. Trench raids to capture prisoners were commonplace. Prisoners would usually confess enemy numbers, their locations, and artillery positions. Artillery engaged in incessant barrages, wearing down the enemy's rear so that death could strike the soldiers most unexpectedly. Even during lulls, when neither side engaged in offensives, casualty lists continued to rapidly grow. Without active hostilities, the 88th Siege Army lost an average of about 2,000 men a day. Undoubtedly, losses were pre-planned, and reinforcements for the Death Corps arrived according to schedule. Life in the trenches forced the Guardsmen to resemble rats, packed together in damp underground shelters. Sentries in the trenches vigilantly scanned for any signs of the enemy. Daily rains and other manifestations of Vraks's fickle climate turned the trenches into flowing streams and no man's land into a continuous quagmire. After some time, the water receded, leaving behind a viscous, grey, muddy mire. Troops arriving at the front line felt as if they had been thrown into a huge furnace, burning unceasingly day and night. Over the Van Mersland wastelands rolled the unceasing roar of artillery salvos and bursting shells. At night, the sky blazed with flares and explosions. As one approached the front line, the number of craters increased, and more corpses lay in the mud with abandoned equipment. Amidst the dead, quartermasters with their aides skulked, stripping the corpses of uniforms, weapons, ammunition, and equipment. All of this would be sent to the rear depots and redistributed among the newcomers. What did a single body mean to these grim figures? A chance to augment the supply lists with gear far more valuable than easily replaceable flesh. Vraks was a monotonous, gloomy wasteland, grey and black, shrouded in a pall of smog that blocked out the sunlight. The air was laden with the stench of decay. In places of failed assaults, unburied dead lay everywhere, as attempts to gather the fallen under constant shelling only led to further losses. Day by day, artillery ground the bodies with its fire until the slain soldiers were dismembered several times over. No man's land was strewn with the decaying fragments of bodies that once were human. Soon, both warring sides began stacking the skulls and bones of the fallen in their trenches, forming gruesome chapels in honour of the bravery and sacrifice of their comrades in arms. They were surrounded by death. As the months of futile standoff dragged on, the air and the very earth became suffused with a pernicious contagion. Thus passed the first year of the siege. The outer defensive line withstood the initial assaults, and the warring sides contented themselves with mutually wearing each other down. Eventually, something, somewhere, would give. But until that time, the armies remained embroiled in the grindstone of slow, mutual annihilation. The battle for Fort A453. In the year 814 of the 41st millennium, the 261st Regiment was ordered to conduct a reconnaissance in force in Sector 45, 49. The 30th Line Corps probed the enemy defences along the entire front in hopes of resuming the offensive after 6 months of relative lull. The Corps was given time to recover strength after the losses suffered at the start of the campaign, and the guns of the 19th Bombardment Corps were relocated to provide fire support for the impending operation. The Ninth Company was given the formidable task of assaulting the enemy stronghold, designated as Fort A453. A453 was a formidable fortified position of interconnected bunkers and dugouts, though its main weapon, the Earthshaker installed in casemates, had already been destroyed by a direct hit from a bombard siege shell. Yet within the dugouts were heavy bolters, each with overlapping fields of fire. All of this was surrounded by anti-tank ditches, minefields and dense tangles of barbed wire, while beneath the bunkers lay fortified bomb shelters with depots for the garrisons, accessible through a network of tunnels stretching kilometers towards the rear. The only assault attempted on the fort was easily repelled. In the darkness, commander of the Ninth Company, Captain Tybork, observed the final preparations of his men. With the first rays of sunlight, he was to lead them into the attack, while higher-ranking officers assessed the fort's strength from a safe distance. A battery of heavy guns had been brought forward to suppress enemy fire during the infantry attack. A new trench was constructed in recent weeks to support the advance. Tybork's guardsmen needed to cover a mere 300 yards to reach the relative safety of the anti-tank ditch. It was still dark when the preliminary bombardment began. Heavy shells flew over the soldiers' heads, crashing onto the indiscernible fortress. In the light of the sharp bursts of exploding shells, Tybork's lead platoon awaited the start of the advance in the forward trench. As the first beams of dawn touched the battered ground, the artillery barrage ceased, and the captain gave the order to leave the trenches. He was the first to climb the ladder. The artillery preparation left no man's land shrouded in thick smoke, and initially the Kriegs quickly crossed the open terrain. The enemy did not take retaliatory action during the first 100 yards. Tybork urged his men on, quickening their pace as they approached the line of barbed wire. Suddenly, the Ninth Company came under fire. Crouching, the captain and his detachments rushed forward until finally reaching the barriers. The guardsmen hastily began cutting the wire under the fire of heavy bolters. Just behind, other squads suffered casualties and couldn't even raise their heads from cover. Yet Tybork and the command detachment managed to make it into the anti-tank ditch. Despite the mounting losses, the Ninth Company rushed after their commander. Already many soldiers had reached the barbed wire, cutting pathways for their comrades and jumping into the ditch. Clambering up the steep glacis, the guardsmen began setting off mines. The defenders had taken precautions in case enemy infantry breached the ditch. Now Tybork's soldiers found themselves trapped. They could start retreating across no man's land under the hurricane fire of the renegades. The captain gestured with his hand, deciding, despite the losses, to advance forward. And he led by personal example, being the first to run up the slope. Mines were exploding to the left and right, but Tybork reached the top, followed by the others after the officer. Right in front of him, a heavy bolter continued hammering from the bunker, mowing down the Kriegs as they emerged into the line of fire. The captain was wounded in the leg by a splinter of bone from a guardsman blown to bloody shreds. Staggering, Tybork gestured to order the bunker to be taken out. By this time, the defenders began reacting to the sudden Imperial assault. Emerging from their night covers, the rebels found the Loyalists right on their doorstep. Some immediately rushed to drive out those who had broken through, and soon fierce hand-to-hand combat boiled across the fort. The others, noticing the Death Corps soldiers nearby, turned to flee, believing the position already lost. A453 was plunged into chaos and confusion. Here, the shells of quadruple mounts began to burst, killing friend and foe indiscriminately. Tybork was once again wounded by shrapnel when the guardsmen tossed grenades into the firing slits of the bunker. He managed to take position in the strong point, but the main task remained, to hold the captured ground. With severe bleeding, the captain took cover behind a ruined barricade made of barrels filled with stones and sandbags. Around him, the Krieg soldiers fired at the fleeing rebels. In the confusion of the advance, Tybork lost his Vox operator, undoubtedly now dead. The platoon required reinforcements to repel the enemy's attacks. The captain called a messenger and ordered him to relay the following to command. The Ninth Company has overcome the barbed wire. The enemy's strength is growing. We will hold if reinforcements arrive." The messenger dashed away. For a grueling hour, Tybork's men fought in complete isolation. The second bunker had been turned into a heap of smouldering ruins by a flamer. The guardsmen were now in several enemy trenches and advancing toward the central bunker. The soldiers recaptured the entrance to the stronghold, and when a melter gun turned the steel doors into a pile of molten metal, Tybork led the assault group down the ferrocrete steps. He found himself in a long gallery where the enemies had hastily erected barricades all along its length. Laser beams sliced through the darkness and bullets ricocheted off the walls. Limping, the captain and the guardsmen charged the defenders and in a fierce bayonet fight cleared the gallery of rebels. An enemy bullet wounded Tybork in the head, but his helmet, which shattered from the impact, saved the officer. The Krieg soldiers drove out the rebels just in time, for outside the rising roar of approaching shells could be heard. The rebels had called artillery fire down upon themselves. On the surface, the earth churned with the direct hits from long-range guns. Those caught in the bombardment were annihilated in fractions of a second, while Tybork and approximately 40 guardsmen took cover below. The intense fire from the enemy batteries ended the battle on the surface, forcing the survivors to stay low. The captain and his soldiers held the gallery, yet after nightfall reinforcements still had not arrived. It seemed the messenger had failed to reach headquarters. The remnants of the Ninth Company had no choice but to hold on to their hard-won positions and hope for a miracle. The brave captain was unaware that the messenger had indeed managed to reach his own. For several hours he had to make his way across no man's land, sprinting from crater to crater under rebel fire. On the way the messenger was wounded, but nonetheless, covered head to toe in mud mixed with blood, the soldier delivered the message to General Durjan, who was surveying the battlefield from the command post. The news of the capture of the enemy position meant a chance to finally break through the enemy's defences. The general hastily dictated new orders to the Vraks operators. Grenadier units will proceed to reinforce the Ninth Company as soon as they are ready. Tybork was in dire need of artillery cover to sever the fort from enemy reinforcements. Distractive attacks across the entire front line will commence immediately to engage enemy forces. Most importantly, the strike was to be delivered with utmost haste. On the morning of the next day, under heavy artillery fire, the grenadier units charged towards A453. During this time, Tybork's men fought in the underground corridors and galleries of the fort. They persisted in the pitch-black darkness illuminated only by grenade explosions. Reinforcements arrived to the rebels through the tunnels. However, they could not overcome the resistance of the Kriegs. Dust and smoke from the explosions swirled in the air, and without their gas masks, the guardsmen would not have survived. The Death Corps soldiers scavenged weapons, grenades and ammunition from the fallen rebels when their own supplies ran low. The Imperials barricaded doors, holding them until struck by enemy fire, at which point comrades would promptly replace the fallen. The Kriegs even used the corpses of their comrades to construct barricades. Tybork's squad was reduced to 16 men, yet throughout the day the captain valiantly repelled the rebel attacks. By dusk, the grenadiers had cleared the remaining surface structures of enemies and began pushing towards the underground shelters. The third day of the battle promised to be decisive. Fort A453 had nearly entirely fallen into the hands of the Kriegs, creating a breach in the rebels' defensive line, and their counterattacks threatened to be fierce. However, General Durjan ordered 3 companies of the 61st Armoured Regiment out of reserve, as well as the super-heavy Bane Blade, and threw them into the boiling battle surrounding the fortress. The column of combat machines was accompanied by Atlas excavators, each equipped with a bulldozer blade for filling in the anti-tank ditch with earth. The complete elimination of the obstacle required the entire morning and the loss of 4 Atlases. The Lehman Russ tanks, along with the Bane Blade, surged forward, tearing through barbed wire and barricades, hurrying to join the defenders of A453. Together they would capitalize on the success and move further. The dam began to break. General Durjan poured more and more forces into the breach, Across the entire front of the 30th Corps, the Imperials launched a ferocious assault. The third day underground was the longest and grim for Tyborg. Attempting to flush the guardsmen from their captured positions, the enemy utilized flamethrowers. The captain possessed no equivalent firepower. The corridors filled with choking black smoke. The Loyalist commander had only one filter left for his gas mask, after which the atmosphere would finish him. Water supplies were depleted. The battery of his las pistol was drained. Moreover, Tyborg suffered new injuries to his legs and abdomen. Trapped in the gallery, the soldiers awaited an inevitable end. Following the flamethrower salvos, the rebels once more charged into the attack. The Kriegs decimated them with grenades and lasgun fire, then hurriedly looted the dead. One of the fallen rebels bore a flamethrower with a half-empty fuel tank. The soldiers returned to their barricades before the enemies could launch another assault. A wall of fire could temporarily block the passage and hold the enemy at bay for a while longer. That night, the battle raged on the surface. Tyborg was unaware that grenadiers had stormed the underground complex and, after sustaining heavy losses, were now holding the main tunnel where they had swiftly planted demolition charges in case of a rebel breach. Nonetheless, corridor after corridor, the Krieg soldiers drove the enemy back. Just before dawn, an Imperial sentry reported finding survivors in the gallery. The grenadiers almost stumbled into friendly fire. Captain Tyborg swayed from numerous wounds in his legs, right arm, abdomen and head, but he stood on his own 2 feet. Only 8 men remained under his command. In his hands, the officer gripped a flamethrower with an empty tank. His uniform was scorched and torn, his helmet shattered. Yet he was alive, and the fortress had been captured. The first breakthrough. The strike of the 30th Line Corps was all-crushing. More and more soldiers along with tanks rushed through the breach at Fort A453, widening the gap. The enemy hastily began marshalling forces in a desperate attempt to halt the influx of Loyalists pouring through the compromised defensive line, dangerously weakening other positions. Suddenly, the endless positional warfare gave way to a massive Imperial offensive. For the next 10 days, battles raged across the surface. Death Corps tanks surged eastward, while the enemy deployed fresh forces in counterattacks. As the Guardsmen advanced, the wastelands were littered with burning vehicle hulls, abandoned artillery positions and forsaken weaponry. The 8th Assault Corps broke into the enemy rear and launched a northward and southward offensive, levelling the rebels' outer fortifications. The defensive structures were designed to withstand a frontal assault, so the sudden appearance of the Death Corps on the flanks led to their complete collapse. Enemy units began abandoning their positions and retreating. They knew a second defensive line lay behind them, so most hurried to reach the intact fortifications. Following the 30th Corps, the 12th Line Corps joined the offensive. The Kriegs surged across no man's land, sweeping away the remaining rebel fortifications, wherein only doomed rearguard garrisons remained. Soon, the 34th Line Corps also broke through the enemy's defences on the Saritamsk hills. Companies of Death Riders pursued the mass retreat of the rebels. Infantry followed behind the cavalry in organised columns, encountering no resistance. After 2 gruelling years of siege, the first defensive line crumbled like a house of cards. Isolated pockets of resistance still remained, desperately attempting to slow the advancing pace, but they were eliminated without significant trouble. The casualties remained unknown for now, yet the first objective of the Vraks siege, capturing the outer line of fortifications, had been accomplished. Chapter 4. War of Attrition. Krieg's method of warfare is defined by their discipline and self-sacrifice. It commands respect from all, both enemies and allies. Lord Commander Militant of Segmentum Obscurus. The First Corps Crisis. After the Krieg forces' breakthrough, the rebels abandoned not only the outer line of fortifications, but also the northern defensive boundaries. These lines were a kind of protrusion from the main defensive positions, and given the prevailing situation, holding them was no longer feasible. The northern positions were flanked, and also threatened by the fully replenished strength of the 1st and 30th Line Corps. Engaging the rebels with frontal attacks, the advance of the 12th Corps could easily sever them from the main forces. If the decision to stand to the end was made, the complete encirclement and elimination of the defenders would only be a matter of time. Unwilling to risk catastrophic defeat while defending unreliable positions, the rebels decided to retreat. The 1st and 30th Corps found the northern lines abandoned and soon began to advance swiftly, encountering only weak rearguard resistance in the form of sniper teams and the unavoidable artillery bombardments. The 1st Corps turned eastward towards Residential Zone 1, located on one of the main routes between the Citadel and the spaceport. As it moved south and east, the 1st Corps also began to encircle the second line of defense of the heretics. Until now, throughout the 2 years of war, the 88th Siege Army relentlessly attacked, while the rebels preferred defensive actions except for counterattacks on captured positions and raids through the Imperial trenches. By the year 815 of the 41st millennium, the strategic situation had changed. As the 1st Corps approached from the north to the second line of defense, it was to become the primary target for the first massive counteroffensive by the enemy. The northern defensive lines might have been relinquished without a fight, yet between the two positions, powerful counterblows were delivered. The rebels accumulated a considerable reserve of combat vehicles in Residential Zone 1. Leman Russ tanks, Chimeras, Basilisks and Griffins, along with their crews, were assembled in one place to prepare a counter-offensive, with the main goal being to catch the Krieg Death Corps units on the march across open terrain outside the protection of the trenches. The 19th Siege Regiment was stationed in Sector 60, 53. Scouts reported nocturnal movements of enemy armoured vehicles. In response, the battery fire was intensified to hinder the enemy's as yet unclear plans. Anticipating a local counterattack, forward companies were reinforced, and by dawn, a heightened state of readiness was declared. Newly constructed trenches, somewhat resembling shallow ditches, were filled with soldiers with lasguns at the ready. The first to reach the Loyalists were enemy shells, initially 1 or 2, before a tornado descended upon the Guardsmen. A massive artillery barrage engulfed the positions of the 19th Regiment, howling and roaring akin to the sea during a storm. Alongside the heavy shells came smoke rounds, emitting thick white gas that veiled the battlefield in an impenetrable shroud. Under the cover of the smokescreen, the first wave of attackers advanced. The drivers of tanks and armoured personnel carriers floored the accelerator and surged through the trembling wasteland towards the Imperials. Behind them, the sun was just peeking over the horizon, a pale disk emerging through the clouds of dust raised by the advancing army. As the rebels drew near, the artillery fire ceased. Through the smoke and dust, the clamour of the approaching war machines resounded like the forges of the underworld unravelled. The tank shells tore bloody chunks from the overcrowded frontline trenches. Reports of advancing enemy tank columns and chimeras came in from the entire front line of the 19th Regiment. As the renegades approached within close range, infantrymen within the transports and on the aft decks of tanks disembarked onto the field of battle. Shouting ungodly battle cries, they charged, bayonets affixed, also wielding knives, axes and mere blades. The Krieg Guardsmen responded to the heretics' frenzied onslaught with a barrage of lasgun, stubber and heavy bolter fire. The attackers suffered losses, yet the tanks' fire systematically obliterated trench after trench. Tons of earth collapsed inward, burying men alive, and entire squads vanished in the spiralling storm of fire and shrapnel. The enemies were like rabid dogs, packs hunting amidst the rain of bullets and shells bursting in the wasteland. One by one, the squads of the Death Corps were crushed, and the insurgents' tanks sprinted forward. 4 quadruplicate mountings of Battery B of the 22nd Field Artillery Company delivered direct fire on the advancing enemy before receiving the order from command to retreat. When the Centaur transports arrived, they came under severe artillery fire. 2 guns and 3 tractors were immediately destroyed by precise hits. The 3rd gun had to be abandoned, but not before each barrel was loaded with a crack grenade so as not to leave valuable weaponry to the enemy. The last piece of the battery was jolting from the shells exploding around the tractor, as the rebel infantry was already occupying the positions abandoned by the Imperials. Peering through his magnoculars, Colonel Adal, commander of the 19th Regiment, observed the unfolding battle through the clouds of smoke and dust raised by the bombardment. Reports of captured trenches had already arrived, and now he watched as the enemy tanks crushed his forward positions. In an attempt to turn the tide of the battle, Adal ordered the reserve companies forward. The enemy's already accelerating assault needed to be halted. The colonel also requested reinforcements from the corps commander. The front line was subjected to a powerful tank attack, and the Imperial's forward positions were already in the hands of the renegades, to whom fresh forces were also beginning to arrive. To hold out, Adal required men, tanks and artillery from the corps reserve. Otherwise, he would have to retreat and organize a new line of defense. Soon, a response came from the High Command. There were no available reserves, and he would have to hold his positions with the forces at his disposal. Retreat was unacceptable. However, the pressure on loyalist forces was mounting, and Adal understood that with the loss of the second trenches, he would either be forced to retreat or face a potential enemy breakthrough. By redistributing units that had not yet entered the battle, he hastily organized a new line of defense centered around his headquarters. The battle continued, and by midday, deadly artillery fire resumed on both sides. Attackers and defenders were intermixed. One ruined trench could be held by loyalists, while the adjacent one might be held by heretics. In the ensuing confusion, the rebels held on stubbornly thanks to tank support. Initially, they withstood an Imperial artillery barrage, and later surged forward once more. During the day, 19 positions with quad-mounted weapons and heavy mortars were captured, and in many cases, the enemy turned the barrels on the loyalists. By nightfall, the fighting subsided, although both sides continued to probe each other fruitlessly. Chaos reigned on the battlefield as a unified front line no longer existed, leaving only a melee of fighting units. At dawn, the rebels resumed their assault and artillery thundered once again. The batteries of the 19th Regiment returned fire, and massive shells flew over the advancing rebel infantry, more like blooded spectres in the harsh morning light, storming one trench after another. Suddenly the heavens opened and unleashed lightning and torrential rain on the combatants, turning the battlefield into a quagmire. Enemy tanks surged forward, buffeted by fierce winds. Colonel Adal watched their approach from his headquarters and in turn prepared the loyalists for defense. Rebel artillery was already targeting Imperial positions, and one shell pierced the roof of the command bunker. Fortunately, the colonel was elsewhere at the time. He was already among the soldiers, directing the guardsmen's fire. As the heretics approached, the air filled with laser beams and bullets, while tank shells exploded among the makeshift barricades. The first onslaught was repelled when Adal himself, laser-gun in hand, fought on sandbagged fortifications. The second attack also faltered, but shallow trenches to the left and right fell to the enemy, leaving the loyalists isolated from their main forces. The only path to salvation lay across terrain well covered by rebel fire. A shell once again struck the command bunker, this time a tank shell, killing Adal's deputy, Colonel Daine. Communication with the rear was cut off, and Adal was left with only 80 guardsmen. The colonel ordered the evacuation of the wounded and divided the survivors into two groups. The first group was to break through to the main forces to deliver a message about the enemy's forces' breakthrough. Adal would take command of the rearguard and hold the position until reinforcements arrived or until the last drop of blood. He understood that the chances of reinforcements were slim, but he was ready to fight for as long as possible. The first group climbed the parapet and headed towards their own, moving under enemy fire from crater to crater. The survivors managed to deliver the colonel's message. Adal himself fought bravely until eventually the rebels brought up a hellhound and incinerated all the loyalists. The colonel's body was never found, as a stream of searing promethium annihilated the Krieg command post along with all the men inside. With the loss of the command post, the second line of defense was also breached and the 19th Regiment's positions were lost. Without a commander, it was no longer possible to coordinate the unit's actions. Isolated groups continued to fight, but as a full combat unit, the 19th Regiment ceased to exist. Hundreds of soldiers now retreated, bypassing artillery batteries where the guns were hastily prepared for evacuation to the rear before the enemy reached them. In the chaos of retreat, a large amount of equipment and ammunition had to be abandoned. The task of collecting all the equipment left after the sudden counter-offensive fell on the shoulders of the First Line Corps. After 2 days of fierce fighting, the enemy finally breached the defences and the First Corps faced a crisis. The collapse of the 19th Regiment on the left flank jeopardised the Corps' entire positions. The rebels would soon outflank the Loyalists and dismantle the unfinished trench lines. As with the rebels previously, now it was the Death Corps' turn to retreat. The ground taken at such high cost had to be left without a fight in favour of retreating to the better fortified positions of the first line of defence. From there, the enemy's counterattack could be contained, but this required rapid action. The primary and foremost task was to slow the enemy's advance to give the Imperial units time to redeploy. The First Corps gathered elements of the 7th Armoured Regiment and the remnants of the Death Riders companies of the 19th. They were intended to be thrown into battle to stall the heretics' advance. This would not fully stop the rebels, but it was vital for the First Corps to gain at least some time. Other units were ordered to retreat to pre-prepared positions, and the 261st was instructed to turn the flank and entrench intensively. This defeat dealt a serious blow to Lord Zuelka's campaign plans. The impact of the bold counterattack and the breach of the Imperial defence was felt by the entire 88th Siege Army. Attacks on all fronts were cancelled, and necessary materials were hastily transferred to the First Corps' control. The 8th Assault Corps was dispatched to support the 1st as the last bastion against a new potential breach, which could lead not only to the loss of valuable positions, but also to defeat in the entire campaign. Heretics had completely seized the initiative. On the 3rd day of the enemy tank offensive, the First Corps finally redirected part of its forces to counter the insurgents. This was not sufficient to hold back the rebels, but it allowed time to be gained for the avalanche of men, guns, vehicles and equipment retreating to the north. In total, the 7th Armoured Regiment fielded 52 tanks, both Lehman Russes and heavy Machari, against more than 100 enemy tanks. According to incoming reports, the number of traitorous machines constantly increased. The 15th Tank Company included a dozen Lehman Russes, and it was commanded from a personal vanquisher by Captain Gerson. When his squadrons rolled out to their positions, the remaining fighters of the 19th Regiment were still passing by them. Soon after, silhouettes of traitor tanks loomed in the south. Opening fire from a long distance, the captain struck his target, from which black smoke began to pour. In the surveyor, he saw the turret of the enemy tank split in half, and a second later, flames burst from the vehicle. The enemy persistently advanced, and armour-piercing shells flew in both directions. One shell ricocheted off Captain Gerson's tank turret, another knocked out the frontal las cannon and mortally wounded the gunner. The captain managed to knock out 2 rebel tanks before taking a third hit. This time the fuel tank was damaged. As the fuel began to leak inside, Gerson ordered the survivors to abandon the vehicle. The last 3 crew members threw open the hatches and jumped out of the tank an instant before the explosion that turned the Vanquisher into a dazzling orange ball of fire. Of the captain's 12 tanks, only 4 remained operational, yet the enemy left at least 16 on the battlefield. As he ordered a retreat, Gerson saw a squadron of Death Riders charging at the enemy with lowered lances in a final act of desperate bravery. A day after endless battles, the Kriegs had 9 Lehman Russes and 2 Macharii left, but the enemy had lost no less. The armoured wedge of the rebels had sustained significant damage. Such holding actions continued daily, and the heretics captured less and less ground each day. 3 days later, the counterattack completely ran out of steam, but it had deeply cut into the positions of the First Corps and forced the Imperials to abandon extensive territories. The 19th Siege Regiment was decimated in the first 2 days, suffering over 80,000 killed or captured, including the commander. Enemy losses were also high, especially in armoured vehicles. The cost of the First Corps' severe ordeal extended beyond losses in manpower, resources and territory. Barely avoiding catastrophe, attacks on all fronts aimed at weakening the enemy had to be cancelled. The enemy was meant to bleed out, but instead he became only stronger. He gained time to reorganize and bring in reinforcements with ammunition, and breaching the second line of defense would now become much more difficult. The battles on the second line of defense. After the chaos of the enemy breakthrough and the First Corps crisis, the attacking regiments of the remaining 3 corps had to halt. Instead of a swift advance, they would have to resort once again to systematic and cautious progress. The second line of fortifications was more powerful and denser than the first, and after a successful counterattack, masses of heretics occupied defensive positions. This bastion of rebels had to be crushed like the previous one with slow attrition. Infantry companies at the front took up shovels and pickaxes once more. Atlantes resumed their work. Soldiers, who had just escaped the cramped trenches, had to build them anew. They would approach the insurgents under artillery cover and the safety of the trenches. Thus, the nightmare work continued, and the trenches with communications sprawled across the Van Meersland wasteland like a web. Soldiers venturing beyond the confines of their immediate sectors could become hopelessly lost in the multi-kilometre labyrinths. The endless artillery duel resumed with its previous intensity, threatening sudden death from mines or shells daily. Each side was desperately fortifying forward positions, making them even more dangerous for the enemy. In the year 816 of the 41st millennium, the 88th Siege Army went on the offensive once again. No fewer than 6 full-blooded regiments took part in the all-out attack. Day after day, the advance exacted a horrific toll on the people, and the guardsmen fought amidst destroyed bunkers, collapsed trenches, rusty expanses of barbed wire, and the bleached bones of fallen comrades in arms. For long months, a routine, murderous scenario unfolded along the entire front line. After hours of massive artillery barrage, Krieg guardsmen moved to assault the rebels' front lines, whether trenches, gun emplacements, or interconnected bunkers. In most cases, the advance sputtered out, with only piles of bodies left on no man's land. In some places, the attack was successful, and the Imperials occupied enemy positions, only to then come under precise fire from heretic batteries. While artillery isolated the Loyalists, the rebels launched a counterattack, reaching the target before reinforcements could arrive for the Kriegs. After close combat, using grenades, entrenching tools and bayonets, the Imperials retreated back. Waves of the Death Corps soldiers surged and receded from the enemy like the tides. The relentless cycle of futile attacks continued, with each advance stalling, and the next day, the attack front had to be expanded to capture adjacent sectors and eliminate fire from the flanks. Key positions could not be taken without clearing the neighbouring sectors. The key to every sector lay upon its flanks, and so it happened everywhere until entire regiments were ordered to attack solely because one company failed to fulfill its objective. The achieved success was minimal, and there was always another flank that needed to be cleared. Hundreds of attacks were launched over months, yet a breakthrough never occurred. For the opposing sides, another year passed without visible success. In the north, the First Corps, reinforced by an influx of recruits from Krieg, once again attempted to advance. Here, trenches stretched across terrain littered with the rusting hulks of destroyed tanks and transports. This land had been captured and subsequently lost. Skirmishes with rebels continued, yet without the protection of bunkers and ferrocrete-fortified defensive lines, the insurgents were extremely vulnerable to the Krieg's artillery. Exposed on open ground, the heretics suffered as never before from the bombardment by Imperial batteries. Massive bombardments forced the rebels to choose, either abandon positions or be annihilated. Gradually, the land yielded and the counteroffensive was won back. It took the Loyalists nearly 6 months to reclaim what had been lost within a week. For a whole year, Residential Zone 1 was subjected to systematic artillery bombardments, after which it was captured virtually without a fight. Subsequently, all prefab homes were razed to the ground. Eventually, the First Line Corps advanced to positions before the Second Defence Line, and the citadel was encircled, starting from Sector 62, 47, and proceeding clockwise to Sector 54, 38, on a 250-kilometre front. In the course of the 88th Army's advance, many of Vraks' outer depots and storehouses were seized by the Guardsmen. These colossal underground bunkers, accessible only via massive freight elevators, were thoroughly looted. The military resources stockpiled within were gone, taken by the insurgents down to the last bullet during their retreat to the citadel. These stockpiles had been the lifeblood of the defenders, enabling them to contend with the massive supply machine of the 88th Army. Daily, hundreds of tons of artillery shells were delivered to the Kriegs, alongside brand-new ordnance barrels and breech blocks for replacement of worn-out ones. Yet it seemed the enemy faced no difficulties in provisioning their forces, and thus the war of attrition continued. A relentless, unyielding meat grinder dragged on endlessly. The siege of Vraks became akin to an insatiable beast, consuming shells and human lives daily. The unending artillery duel once again turned the front line into a field pockmarked with overlapping craters, some tens of feet deep. Across no man's land, poisonous haze from a mix of cordite, dust and corpse poison from countless decomposing bodies spread anew. Thus passed 1 year, then another, and the living conditions only deteriorated further. Wherever the Death Corps gained an advantage, they were soon repelled by the counterattacks of the rebels. For the most part, the Imperial regiments were only required to hold the defensive line. It was impossible and undesirable to constantly conduct offensive operations across the entire front. This did not mean that the front lines were quiet and peaceful. Even when no attacks were planned, both opposing sides asserted their presence with aggressive actions, inevitably provoking the enemy's retaliatory measures. Frequent skirmishes led to increased casualties, especially during night bomb raids, when small groups ventured into no man's land and hurled bundles of grenades into enemy trenches. Operations to capture sentries for subsequent interrogation were also frequently conducted. Both the Imperials and heretics employed tactics of constant attrition against each other, depriving the opponent of even a moment's respite or rest. Such operations never aimed to capture land, and attacks by platoons or individual companies were discouraged, even in response to enemy actions, as capturing small territories was too insignificant a task against the backdrop of the campaign's large-scale military plans. This resulted in a situation where the front line remained static for prolonged periods, sometimes years. The commanders of the Death Corps awaited a major breakthrough, which could only be achieved by wearing down the enemy, followed by exploiting success in a combined arms general offensive. In the year 818 of the 41st millennium, the 158th Regiment undertook a large-scale raid on Sector 50, 45, where the defense laser mines, part of the orbital defense network of Vraks, were located. The batteries themselves were deep underground to protect the guns from orbital bombardment, so any artillery barrage had little chance of inflicting significant damage. The heretics inside were under no threat. So, to preserve the element of surprise, the Kriegsmen decided to dispense with preliminary artillery preparation. The attack would be led by grenadier detachments, who would infiltrate no man's land and quickly seize the surface fortifications of the laser battery, after which, at dawn, infantry would arrive to provide assistance for the final clearing of the mine. The outer defences included barbed wire, a dense minefield, and several reinforced firing points. Under the cover of night, the grenadiers left their trenches and began to stealthily advance from crater to crater toward enemy positions. As soon as a flare shell exploded in the sky, the guardsmen froze and feigned death. As the light faded, the grenadiers resumed their advance. Orienting in darkness was difficult, so several detachments soon became lost. One of them accidentally stumbled upon an enemy patrol that was stealthily making its way toward Imperial positions, likely intending to conduct reconnaissance or else throw a few grenades into the trenches. A firefight erupted, but to the sentries of the traitors it appeared as yet another routine nocturnal skirmish with the Loyalists. Reaching their targets, the squads found everything quiet and began clearing the first line of wire entanglements. As the guardsmen crawled through the opening, an illuminating flare burst above their heads with a yellow blossom. The grenadiers froze, yet an observant sentry spotted unfamiliar figures within the perimeter. The sentry raised the alarm, and a laser beam sliced through the night's darkness. Suddenly, a frenzy of gunfire ensued. A heavy bolter tore through the soldiers caught at the wire, while the rebels in the subterranean barracks leapt to their feet at the furious cries of their officers. The covert assault had been discovered. The grenadiers could either retreat or continue the advance, for they would simply be cut down amidst the wire entanglements. The first squads extricated themselves from the barbed wire and charged forward, fully aware that they were stepping onto a minefield. The night was lit up with explosions and gunfire. The Master Sergeant of the Grenadiers shouted for the soldiers to follow him, but his speech was abruptly cut short by a heavy bolter shell that decapitated the guardsman. The line of wire was engulfed in fire, grenades bursting and the wounded screaming. A stream of flame from a flamer consumed one of the bunkers. Against the backdrop of the inferno, the silhouettes of fleeing guardsmen became discernible as they rushed towards the nearest cover. The first units of rebels had already begun arriving from the underground barracks. Complete chaos reigned. In the greenish hues of dawn, the laser shaft was shrouded in smoke and dust. The Imperial officers, peering into scanners, could discern little in such a setting. No reports of the mission's successful completion were received, but none of the surviving attackers returned to report failure either. The battle still raged, and orders were given to continue the advance according to the original plan. At the appointed time, infantry companies poured onto no man's land, yet the fresh loyalist forces were unaware that things had gone badly for the grenadiers. Amidst the confusion of the nocturnal skirmish, the guardsmen failed to neutralize the ground fortifications, meaning the new wave of infantry had to approach the traitors' gun emplacements across open terrain once again. Soon, everything followed the usual pattern. A hail of fire pinned the attackers to the ground, after which an artillery battery volley enveloped them, turning no man's land into a tomb of charred, concussed, and disemboweled bodies. After a while, the survivors began crawling back to their trenches. In response, bombard batteries opened fire on the laser shaft, continuing to bombard heretic positions until nightfall. The next day, when the dense veil of dust cleared, external damage became visible, though the lasers themselves remained unharmed and functioned as before. It was a bitter exchange, yet exemplary of the encounters occurring daily along the front line. Several hundred guardsmen perished in a forlorn attack, and without doubt the defending side suffered far fewer losses. Only a handful of surviving grenadiers managed to make it back to the Imperial trenches. Most were killed, and those taken prisoner were tortured during interrogation, after which they were executed. The bodies of the unfortunate were displayed on barbed wire as a grim reminder of their fate. A new threat. Since the first artillery salvo marking the official beginning of the siege of Vraks, 7 years had passed, 7 years of exhausting and fierce battles where millions died over a few kilometers of land. Each side had its victories and defeats, and both suffered horrifying casualties, yet neither the Imperials nor the rebels came close to collapse. In the year 820 of the 41st millennium, new reports delivered to the headquarters of Lord High Commander Zuelka on Thracia Primaris led to widespread concern. Not only was the campaign on Vraks significantly behind schedule, but, if the reports were to be believed, the heretics had also received reinforcements. During an attack by the 261st Regiment in Sector 52-49, several Gorgon assault transports managed to breach enemy positions and posed a threat to break through the heretics' second line of defense. As usual, the enemy counterattacked, but this time the counteroffensive involved armored Space Marines. The Adeptus Astartes in dark blue armor launched a swift strike that closed the breach created by the Loyalists and destroyed all the Gorgons. How had Space Marines come to fight on the side of the Vraxian rebels? Whoever they were, they represented a mortal threat. Due to the nature of warfare on the Armory world, chapters of Space Marines were not involved in the conflict. Not a single chapter master would send his battle brothers into the quagmire of a slow war of attrition. The campaign had reached a standstill for both sides, and the arrival of the Adeptus Astartes could tip the scales in favour of the rebels. Lord High Commander Zuelka immediately dispatched his emissaries to the Lord Commander Militant of Segmentum Obscurus. Could he identify this chapter? Alongside his message, Zuelka requested new infantry corps to be sent to Vraks. In his opinion, these additional forces would help bring the campaign back to the previously agreed timeline and shift the balance on the second line of defence. The request was sent through the channels of the Departamento Munitorum, and the officials began to find means to transport more troops from Krieg. As for the Adeptus Astartes, it remained an unsolved mystery. Those chapters in the segmentum that bore dark blue as their colours could account for their companies. The conclusion was made that these were most likely traitor legionaries, drawn to Vraks by the intensity of the battles and wishing to earn the favour of their dark gods through bloodshed. Zuelka's headquarters were assured that steps were being taken to counter this new threat. The commanders of the 88th Siege Army did not suspect that Vraks had indeed drawn the attention of the traitor legions. News of the uprising and fierce battles particularly intrigued one traitor, who had now decided to join the fray. This was Lord Arcos, a former captain of the Alpha Legion. His battle barge, Heart of Anarchy, slipped into the Vraks system and disembarked battle brothers at the spaceport. Disguised as newly arrived space marines, they infiltrated the Krieg defences and, under the guise of a new offensive, crossed no man's land. Once inside the citadel, Arcos and his followers presented themselves to His Eminence, offering assistance and support on behalf of all the Dark Gods. The Lord of Chaos could provide the rebels not only with elite troops skilled in raids behind enemy lines and sabotage operations, but also in training the militia. Arcos himself could share his vast combat experience. His Legion brothers, all unconditionally loyal to their commander and the gods, eagerly awaited the opportunity to participate in the war. Vraks, Arcos explained, was the anvil upon which the entire Scarus sector would be broken. Victory here could lead to great victories in the future. One successful rebellion would ignite a mighty flame of insurrection, and there were already many allies ready to support this fire in various locations. The Lord of Chaos also promised more allies in the future. Other bands would hear of Vraks and rush to join the battle. Arcos was a valuable and powerful ally for Zafan, and the Cardinal gladly accepted his help. The traitor legionnaires were immediately put to use. Chapter 5, Angels of Caliban. Our will to vengeance overcomes all. Supreme Grand Master Azrael, Dark Angels, chapter. Reinforcements. In the 821st year of the 41st millennium, the requests of Lord Commander Militant Zuelka were finally fulfilled. A convoy of transport ships entered the Vraks system, ferrying the additional 46th Line Corps, consisting of 3 regiments to disrupt the established balance on the second line of defence. These forces were meant to be dispatched to other hotspots, but now Zuelka's political influence began to bear fruit. The Lord Commander Militant's office also sent completely unexpected reinforcements. The arrival of reinforcements to aid the Vraksian rebels was alarming and potentially catastrophic news, especially if other bands of traitors, eager for battle, plunder and devastation in the glory of their gods, were to follow. It was imperative to prevent an escalation of the conflict in the Arsenal world at all costs. The Lord Commander Militant decided to act independently of his subordinates and dispatched delegations to enlist the support of the Adeptus Astartes. The first to respond were the Dark Angels, the infamous first founding chapter, whose base in the Caliban system allowed them to quickly react to the request. The chapter, under the adept command of Supreme Grand Master Azrael, deployed massive forces, nearly half of the Battle Brothers. Toward Vraks surged the battle barge Angel of Retribution, along with 2 strike cruisers, Sword of Caliban and Deliverance, accompanied by a small escort fleet. Azrael did not send any messages to the command of the 88th Siege Army. He simply focused on his own objective, the destruction of the Vraks starport. This would completely sever the world from receiving off-world reinforcements. Assistance from the Dark Angels was not needed, and the Grand Master saw no reason to involve the Imperial Guard regiments in the actions. While Zuelka's headquarters adjusted campaign plans due to the arrival of the new Line Corps, Azrael's ships and his magistrates reached a low orbit, and toward the surface of Vraks surged Thunderhawks, along with drop pods. Azrael's plan. The Supreme Grand Master chose the Cerner Plains for the landing, at the foot of the Aberos Hills, just south of the starport. His fleet took positions outside the range of orbital laser batteries and released the Thunderhawks, which entered the atmosphere and circled the planet to reach the landing zone. Where an Imperial regiment might take weeks to offload from orbit, the Dark Angels required mere hours. On the launch decks, the roar of engines of the ships taking off one by one with companies of space marines and equipment echoed. Back and forth shuttled the transport Thunderhawks, laden with vehicles and supplies. Azrael selected his goal for several reasons. The first was obvious. The starport served as the simplest route for the arrival of off-world reinforcements. The second was the fact that such an attack would force the rebels to divert forces to counter the new threat. At the moment, the starport was guarded by only a small garrison, since the Krieg divisions posed no direct threat there, allowing the troops to be freed for the front line. The Dark Angels could draw enemy forces into a new battle, thereby supporting the offensives of the 88th Siege Army and bringing the long-awaited breakthrough closer. The third reason was known only to the Dark Angels, and perhaps best explained the chapter's swift response. There were traitor legionnaires present on Vraks. These renegades might possess information about the so-called Fallen. Azrael had no substantial evidence that the Fallen were among the heretics' allies. However, the inner circle of the Dark Angels was well acquainted with the name of Arcos. This was a despicable traitor from the ancient times of the Horus heresy. If Supreme Commander Zuelka could not identify the power armor of the forces opposing him, the inner circle clearly understood who these fighters were. To extract information from the captured renegades, the Grand Master brought with him the interrogator chaplain Belphegor. After Azrael decided to deploy the chapter to Vraks, detailed discussions of the attack plan began. The Supreme Grand Master was not inclined to engage in a war of attrition. Instead, he would direct a column of fast armoured vehicles through the plains of Cerner, encircle the spaceport, and strike at the most vulnerable point in the enemy's defences. The correct timing of the attack was crucial. It required waiting long enough for the arrival of the rebels' reinforcements, but not too long to avoid an excessive gathering of enemy forces. Azrael would send his battle brothers into intense street fighting without the most powerful means of support at his disposal: orbital bombardment from a battle barge and strike cruisers. The Dark Angels spacecraft would not risk entering the coverage area of the laser batteries. The Supreme Grand Master only took calculated risks. Once the attack began, Azrael would try to block the combat zone from the arrival of reinforcements by seizing and destroying the main transport arteries throughout the Cerner and Ballan Basin rupture. This was a system of mighty paved crossings connecting working roads across vast chasms. With their destruction, reinforcements from the Citadel would not be able to reach the spaceport. The execution of this task was assigned to the 3rd Company under the command of Captain Orius. The 3rd Battle Company would sequentially strike at each bridge, landing from Thunderhawks, suppressing resistance, and setting explosive charges on the targets. Subsequently, they would move to assist the rest of the strike group in the spaceport area. For the insurgents, the arrival of highly mobile Adeptus Astartes created a serious strategic problem. The Dark Angels could strike anywhere and at any time. They could simply fly over defensive positions and directly attack the Citadel itself. Now the wisdom of Arcos proved particularly sought after and accurate in judgment. The Adeptus Astartes would not risk attacking the fortress with a full garrison. No, instead, they would seek other methods to influence the course of the campaign. Nevertheless, His Excellency had to be able to repel the Dark Angels' strike, wherever they might deliver it, so forces withdrew from the second line to strengthen other areas, including the spaceport. The presence of just 500 Space Marines was already affecting the course of the war. The battle for Vraks spaceport. The Dark Angels advanced in the year 821 of the 41st millennium. First, they had to cover 200 kilometers across the plains of Surna. Columns of land raiders, predators, rhinos, vindicators and whirlwinds rushed in pursuit of the Raven-wing land speeders, skimming the ground, keenly watching for any signs of the enemy. The land speeder squadrons maintained constant communication with the Thunderhawk flotillas, now performing the role of aerial coverage for the advancing tanks and ready to deliver a preemptive strike should the enemy appear. The only forces not taking part in the advance on the spaceport were Aureus's company. They held the defences around the base, awaiting the moment to commence their part of the operation. As the tank columns of the Dark Angels traversed the plains, the rebels dispatched their reconnaissance groups. The sentinels with the salamanders began to scour the plains of Surna in search of the enemy. From time to time, sparks and flames would erupt around a sentinel as a land speeder roared overhead, firing out of its assault cannons. Soon, the rebel commanders knew that the Dark Angels were heading north to the spaceport. Reinforcements were immediately dispatched to strengthen the garrison. A few hours later, the vanguard of the Space Marines, led by Azrael himself in his personal land raider Prometheus, named Angelus Imperator, spotted the outlines of the spaceport ahead. Battles for the bridges. Meanwhile, the Thunderhawks with Captain Aurea's troops were approaching the bridge over the Balantia Basin. The first 3 craft of the squadron banked, and flying over the eastern end of the kilometre-long bridge, dropped their assault squads. After a brief descent, 2 squads of Dark Angels landed directly on the eastern exit, instantly crushing the defenders. Most fled in terror before the wrath of the Adeptus Astartes, while the remaining brave ones were quickly slaughtered. The bridge was held by a small garrison, sufficient only to hold key defensive points, so the advancing Dark Angels found it easy to rout them. The second and third Thunderhawks opened fire with turbo lasers and launched missiles, tearing massive chunks from the ancient bridge and turning bunkers into smoking ruins. After landing, the tactical squad disembarked down the ramps and rushed into the attack, firing their bolters. The rebels began to retreat in disarray under the furious onslaught, but quickly found themselves cut off by the Dark Angels' assault squads that had already secured the eastern exit of the bridge. Trapped between 2 groups, the garrison perished to the last man. It took Master Aurea no more than a few minutes to capture the objective. He immediately began mining the bridge, deploying Devastator squads on its eastern end beforehand. Soon, enemy armoured vehicles were spotted on the road, rushing to aid the spaceport. One accurate hit to the frontal armour from a Lascanon set the lead tank ablaze, and the crew members, engulfed in flames like living torches, jumped from the stricken vehicle. The chimeras following the tank bypassed the burning wreck, blocking the road, only to fall into the effective range of Aurea's heavy weaponry. Crack missiles and volleys of Lascanon fire turned the columns of armoured vehicles into piles of smoking debris. A couple of minutes after the battle began, the terrain was littered with ruined Leman Russes, chimeras, sentinels and basilisks. While the Devastators defended the approaches to the bridge, the assault squads completed the mining operations, placing demolition charges in each of the bridge's supports. The Master gave his troops the order for immediate evacuation, and the Battle Brothers boarded the arriving Thunderhawks. The entire assault cost the Dark Angels 3 wounded, who, thanks to their enhanced physiology, remained operational. As soon as the last aerial transport surged towards the north, Aureus activated the explosive devices. Massive explosions destroyed the supports, after which the majestic bridge groaned, creaked and collapsed under its own weight. The debris fell into the abyss of the Balan Basin, leaving behind only a cloud of thick dust rising skyward. The main route for reinforcements had been severed, and by the end of the day, Aureus's detachment would seize and destroy all remaining bridges across the Surna Basin. By the Emperor's wrath. Surveying the plains with the rising spires and roofs of the spaceport on the horizon from the dome of his land raider, Azrael received a message from the Vox operator. In Sector 74-46, the Raven-wing scouts had detected an enemy tank column moving south from the spaceport. The enemy was approaching. The Supreme Grand Master directed the Thunderhawk fighters to intercept and ordered the forces to advance against the rebels. From his command land raider, Azrael saw the assault ships making low-altitude attacks on the rebel columns. The enemy began deploying Hydras, but the missiles with laser cannons and the Thunderhawk's turbolasers severely thinned the ranks of the enemy vehicles in the open terrain. Without air cover, the enemy had only to hope for the mercy of the Thunderhawks. By this time, the reconnaissance land speeders had guided the lead land raiders into battle, and the planes were enveloped by the slowly creeping smoke from the burning wrecks. The heavy armoured vehicles crashed into the remaining enemy tanks, piercing with fire from the laser cannons, the Lehman Russes and Chimeras, hurrying to reach the relative safety of the spaceport. Azrael's strike went right through the positions of the heretics, then turned east to encircle the spaceport. The Supreme Grand Master had already received confirmation from Brother Orius of the First Bridge's destruction. Now Azrael intended to attack the spaceport from the east, thereby drawing the main part of the garrison to himself, after which to advance the Third Company to assault from the west, pinning the rebels between Orius's anvil and his hammer. The first to fly into the perimeter of the spaceport were the Ravenwing land speeders, reporting on the best routes for advancement. Then Azrael pushed forward the Vindicators with support from battle brothers in Rhinos and Razorbacks. The tanks crushed the buildings where the enemy infantry was sheltering, after which the Dark Angels cleared the ruins of any survivors. The Adeptus Astartes acted with ruthless efficiency, and so far everything was going according to plan. The Supreme Grand Master's assault group was carving a path through the streets of the spaceport, bringing colossal destruction with them. Overhead, the rearmed Thunderhawks mercilessly bombarded the heretics' resistance enclaves. The whirlwinds rained volley after volley on the spaceport, receiving coordinates from the Second Company's spotters, who identified enemy concentrations and instantly slipped out of the strike zone. The enemy was subjected to relentless assaults by the armoured divisions of the Supreme Grand Master as they carefully advanced, sweeping everything in their path. Even the onset of night did not slow the advance, and Azrael continued to fight in the darkness. With the first rays of the sun, the Dark Angels cleared the eastern approaches to the northern landing zones, forcing the rebels to retreat in disorder. Before dawn, the Third Company also took up positions, landing to the west of the main landing zones and deploying like a backstop against the enemy's retreat. By dawn, the enemy had occupied the massive structures surrounding the spaceport. Warehouses, hangars, and repair depots were transformed into formidable strongpoints, despite the unceasing bombardment of the whirlwinds. The rebels fortified their positions as best as they could, using even overturned maintenance vehicles from the runways as barricades. The roar of approaching Thunderhawks was heard once more, rushing to deliver their deadly cargo onto the heads of the heretics. On the second day of battle, Azrael confined himself to weakening the enemy, sending out patrols and probing enemy positions. He allowed the rebels to gather more men within their defensive ring. The Supreme Grand Master's goal was not merely the destruction of the spaceport, but the complete annihilation of all its defenders. The second day passed with sporadic skirmishes. Yet the echo of exploding whirlwind rockets and the return salvos of the rebels' batteries continued to roll through the streets. More accurately, resembling a pitiful imitation of return salvos, as the mobility of the Dark Angels' artillery, changing position after each strike, made it scarcely vulnerable to heretic fire. At dawn on the third day, the landing zones had definitively begun to resemble a battlefield. After repeated air raids and missile strikes, streets everywhere were littered with piles of masonry mixed with debris. From the intelligence gathered by yesterday's patrols, Azrael now clearly envisioned where he would strike with all his might. The Supreme Grand Master gathered the battle brothers of the Sixth Company, mostly from the tactical squads, and placed them under the personal command of Interrogator Chaplain Belphegor, bestowing upon them the great honour of going into battle with the sacred standard of devastation. The precious relic was entrusted to a seasoned veteran, Brother Anmail, personally chosen by Azrael. The company, inspired by the double honor bestowed upon it, was to head south and, after a swift assault, cut off the defenders. Accompanied by vindicators, whirlwinds, and predators, the warriors launched an attack and soon engaged in combat with the heretics. The Space Marines excelled in unmatched prowess in close combat, and the streets were engulfed in dust and rubble as the vindicators fired point-blank at the buildings. Dark green figures could be seen moving through the ruins, periodically dousing the defenders with streams of bright orange flames. After a day of heavy fighting, the streets were piled with the dead. Belphegor reported that the souls of 15 battle brothers had joined the Emperor, but the southern sectors were now cleansed of the enemy. On the fourth day, Azrael again began to fortify positions and bombard the heretics with a hail of bombs. The Dark Angels' patrols continued their advance through the debris mixed with shattered glass, but no decisive breakthrough was foreseen today. The Supreme Grand Master understood that the rebels in the spaceport were cut off from reinforcements and supplies, and time was on his side. The Thunderhawks delivered fuel and ammunition for the Assault Marines' combat machines. The Dark Angels had been fighting without respite for 3 days already, yet their power armor sustained them, and they could continue in the same spirit for a much longer time. After consolidating positions, Azrael summoned the company commanders for a briefing. Gathered within the Angelus Imperator, the veterans discussed the best ways to eliminate the pockets of resistance they had created among the rebels. They approved a plan for conducting concentric attacks. First, Azrael's forces would advance from the east, then Belphegor's company from the south, and finally Aureus would strike from the west. Over the course of 3 days, the enemy perimeter was to be squeezed into progressively smaller sizes. Afterwards, the Supreme Grand Master would personally lead the Battle Brothers in a decisive assault supported by the Deathwing Terminator squads that had yet to partake in the engagement. So it was decided. Over the span of 3 days, each company tightened the noose around the heretics ever harder. Every day, the Adeptus Astartes, supported by tanks and dreadnoughts, systematically drove the rebels out of the buildings amid heavy fighting. With the still dominant Thunderhawks in the skies, the insurgents had little chance. All local counterattacks were repelled. In the course of the advance, Aureus's third company reported that after capturing several landing pads, they encountered and engaged with units of traitor legionnaires, the unholy followers of Arcos. The Alpha Legion had deployed forces for the defense of the spaceport, and Azrael wished to capture as many traitors as possible. In the final confrontation, capturing the Chaos Space Marines would become one of the primary objectives for the Deathwing. The Dark Angels went for the decisive assault 8 days after the start of the battle for the spaceport. The Supreme Grand Master once more boarded his Land Raider and, accompanied by elements of the 1st, 2nd, 5th, 8th and 9th companies, proceeded to finally crush the remnants of enemy resistance. The Adeptus Astartes descended upon the heretics with full force, paying no heed to the shells exploding around them. There could be no talk of mercy, for those who turned away from the Emperor's light deserved only death. For 10,000 years, the righteous fury had not extinguished in the souls of the angels of Caliban, and now they longed to exact vengeance for the ancient betrayal that nearly destroyed their beloved chapter and the Imperium of Man. The battle was fierce and bloody, but the renegades could not hope to withstand the armoured might of the Deathwing. 5 squads of Terminators armed with stormbolters, autocannons and heavy flamers flushed the enemies out of one building after another. In the heat of battle, the command Land Raider was struck by a lascannon blast, resulting in the loss of a side sponson. The subsequent explosion of heavy bolter ammunition damaged the machine's tracks, immobilizing the Angel of the Emperor. At this, Azrael donned the lion helm and, accompanied by his silent companion clad in a robe, along with the command squad, descended the frontal ramp onto the flame-scorched street, shouting, "Vengeance! Vengeance! Vengeance!" The Supreme Grand Master stormed the enemy ranks with the black sword of secrets held high. The warriors' white robes were stained red with the blood of the fallen enemies, many of whom fled in terror before the ferocious fury of the Dark Angel. The other battle brothers arrived to support the commander, and it seemed the outcome of the battle was decided. But then the Alpha Legion struck back. Skilled veterans lay in ambush, using rebellious militia as bait for the loyal Space Marines. At last the time came to spring the trap, and emerging from their cover, the traitors unleashed a hurricane of bolter fire on Azrael's warriors. The Supreme Grand Master saw rounds perforate Brother Anmail, and the sacred standard fell from the standard-bearer's hands. Azrael could not allow the ancient banner to lie in the dirt, and was duty-bound to retrieve the relic at any cost. Rushing under the heretic's fire toward the banner, he reached it at the same moment as the enemy. Dark angels and Alpha Legionnaires clashed over the body of fallen Brother Anmail, and neither side was willing to concede. As the Loyalists fought their way out of the traitor's trap, Azrael slew the last of the foes and raised the sacred standard. Then from the smoke emerged a massive figure in armor, adorned with blasphemous runes and the unholy eight-pointed star of chaos undivided. Arcos himself presented himself for a duel with Azrael. An assault marine rushed to intercept him, but the champion of the ruinous powers cleaved the Loyalist in half with one swing of his warp-infused blade. Two mighty heroes clashed in a duel. In one hand, the Supreme Grand Master gripped the sacred standard of devastation. In the other, the sword of secrets. The opponents delivered crushing blows to each other until blood seeped from the seams of Azrael's expertly crafted armor. The relentless Chaos Lord succeeded in wounding the leader of the Dark Angels. Each summoned the last vestiges of strength, but on that day, Arcos was bolstered by the combined might of the four Chaos Gods. Reciting a litany to his Dark Lords, the traitor pushed the weakening Azrael back, then with a shoulder thrust and swift blow, cast the Supreme Grand Master to the ground, knocking the Sword of Secrets from his grasp. Lying amid the debris, still holding the sacred standard, Azrael watched the approach of doom. The Chaos Lord loomed over the fallen Dark Angel and erupted into triumphant laughter before raising the dark sword to finish his mortal enemy. Yet just as he was about to end the reign of the Supreme Grand Master, Arcos suddenly recoiled as he was struck by a burst of rounds from an assault cannon. Terminators of the Deathwing, led by Belphegor, who raised his Crozius Arcanum, were rushing to the commander's aid. Catching Arcos off guard, the interrogator chaplain struck the legionnaire down with a mighty blow, shattering his armor. Now the Chaos Lord lay stunned and bleeding. The spiritual leader quickly glanced at the prone Azrael, nearly losing consciousness from pain. When Belphegor turned back, Arcos had vanished, dissolving into a whirlwind of dust like smoke. Azrael was seriously wounded during the duel, but the apothecaries quickly got him back on his feet and transported him on a Thunderhawk to the battle barge for further healing. Command of the ground forces was assumed by Master Orias. Meanwhile, the rebels were fighting their final battle. The Alpha Legion retreated, recalled by their fleeing commander. The Chaos Space Marines' ambush inflicted significant losses on the Dark Angels, but the traitors could not hope to win alone. The surviving militia attempted to flee the starport, and for another 2 days the Imperials hunted down scattered groups of rebels. 10 days later, the starport was finally in the hands of the Dark Angels, and they immediately began planting demolition charges in key structures. 2 days later, the starport was completely destroyed beyond repair, and right before departing to the barge, the Marines additionally mined the landing platforms. The 10-day battle ended in victory, but the Dark Angels paid a high price for it. The Supreme Grand Master was recovering from his wounds, and the bearer of the sacred standard, Brother Anmail, perished, along with nearly 200 Dark Angels who would need to be replaced. The chapter captured not a single living traitor legionnaire. Though the battle barge's cells were bursting with captured renegade militia, each soon to face the interrogator chaplain. Azrael sent the command of the 88th Siege Army on Thracia Primaris a terse message. By the Emperor's wrath, the starport of Vraks is destroyed, task accomplished. Then the strike force departed. Chapter 6, Breakthrough. To retreat is to suffer defeat. Forward, forward. In our death lies victory. Captain Dinos, 19th Company of the 468th Regiment. The Great Push. 9 years had passed since the siege began. By this point, the 88th Siege Army was supposed to have broken through the resistance of the first two defensive echelons, secured the third, and had the citadel within range of the Loyalist heavy artillery. However, in the 9 years, the war had not proceeded strictly according to plan, and the army had to request more manpower. However, the success of the Dark Angels instilled new hope in Lord Zuelka, granting him a chance to redeem past failures with a decisive breakthrough. 3 fresh regiments provided the necessary strength for the commanders to organize a crushing offensive. Due to heavy losses, the siege regiments were severely weakened, and their commanding officers were content with holding the defensive line. Wearing down the enemy and organizing pinpoint, uncoordinated strikes, in the hope that one day one of the operations would create the first crack in the dam of the enemy fortifications. However, Lord Zuelka was running out of time, being given 12 years to complete the mission, and Krieg's resources were arriving at Vraks in significant quantities. He ordered the 3 newly arrived and already positioned forward regiments to make a general breakthrough, a large-scale offensive on all fronts with the aim of creating sustained pressure on the enemy's second line of defence. This would force the enemy to bring up reserves, which the Krieg forces would harry with artillery bombardments and powerful infantry attacks. Eventually, on some section, the heretics would break, an opportunity the assault corps would seize by rushing into the breach toward the inner defensive lines. Should the offensive be swift enough, there was a chance to storm the inner defensive positions and establish a foothold before the enemy could dig in again. Such a push would require time to develop attack plans, position and supply the artillery with necessities, restock battle-worn regiments with personnel and supplies, clear minefields, and most importantly, stockpile a sufficient quantity of shells so that the preliminary artillery barrage would be the most powerful of the entire war. For the 88th Siege Army, organizing an operation of such magnitude would be a daunting task. But upon completion, the army would be prepared for the great, potentially decisive, battle of the entire campaign. The time for the new offensive was set for the year 822 of the 41st millennium. The rebels did not miss the large-scale preparations for the attack. Patrols with watch posts reported an increase in the number of soldiers on the front line and the accumulation of ammunition and equipment. Shells rained down on the Krieg trench lines in an attempt to stall preparations. The Loyalists responded with counter-battery fire. Every destroyed enemy gun now meant fewer shells to rain down on the infantrymen preparing to advance. Meanwhile, the allocation of artillery tasks for the time of the Great Breakthrough was completed, and as in previous times they were exceedingly complex, requiring precision and coordination from every battery. The tasks included setting up smoke screens, destroying enemy anti-tank traps and barbed wire, suppressing infantry, destroying guns and bunkers with road networks in the enemy rear. While the artillery conducted their preparations, infantry officers received detailed attack instructions. Each company was assigned specific tasks and detailed plans on how and where their platoons would be positioned to achieve the objectives. As the hour of H approached, the activity became feverish. In the year 822 of the 41st millennium, the preliminary bombardment commenced. Every gun of the 88th Army unleashed a hurricane of fire upon the enemy, illuminating the skies with flashes of flame. The batteries thundered day and night in an attempt to break the defenders' resistance. While the ground around shook with monstrous explosions and the air filled with acrid smoke, the heretics endured the bombardment under many layers of earth and ferrocrete in deep underground shelters. The defenders grimly awaited the impending assault, as the front line was shrouded in a veil of flame, smoke and dust, visible even from orbit. At night, the communication trenches began to fill with men. The first wave took up their positions. The soldiers of the second wave were also ready, standing shoulder to shoulder, burdened with extra gear, grenades, ammunition and rations for the upcoming battle. As lightning tore the skies, and the Van Meersland wastelands were cloaked in orange flashes from the endless bombardment, more than 2 million infantrymen moved into attack positions. Finally, the first faint rays of dawn broke the darkness. The objectives beyond no man's land were mostly obscured by thick smoke clouds. At last, the guns increased their tempo, raining the final fragmentation and incendiary shells onto the enemy fortifications, and then all fell silent. The fury of the artillery barrage ceased, and for a moment the battlefield was plunged into silence. Day 1. An order to commence the offensive swept through all the Voxcasters in the front-line trenches. As one, the guardsmen rushed to the ladders and parapets, surging into no man's land in waves. The commanders had only a brief moment to observe the advancement of the troops before they vanished into the walls of dust and smoke. Regimental leaders could do nothing more. The colossal war machine was set in motion, and the outcome of the battle would be determined by the actions of companies, platoons, and squads. From the command bunkers, they listened intently to the transmissions to gain a clearer picture of the events at the fronts, where the assault met with success and where it faltered, where reinforcements were needed and where the enemy defence was on the brink of collapse. Beyond no man's land, the heretics swiftly reacted to the cessation of the artillery barrage. They knew full well what would follow, and they rushed haphazardly to the defensive positions. In many places, the fortifications had been swept away by the 4-day tornado of bombardment, forcing many to take shelter with weapons at the ready in the ruins. The smoke could not stop bullets or laser beams, and even though the targets had not yet appeared in view, the heretics unleashed a deadly volley. Under the cover of the dust clouds, the advancing guardsmen could not see the enemy, but they were alerted to its presence by the roar of heavy bolters, the staccato bursts of stubbers, and the staccato volleys of autoguns. Soldiers began to fall, yet the attackers pressed forward relentlessly. Soon, the batteries of the heretics that survived the bombardment struck back. No man's land was well ranged, so the traitors' return fire was swift and accurate. As the shelling intensified, shells began to burst among the ranks of the advancing Krieg soldiers. On the no-man's land, entire squads vanished under a wall of deadly shrapnel. The artillery bombardment led to the complete failure of the 158th Regiment's assault in Sector 50. 45. Under the might of the barrage, the wave of attackers began to roll back. The commissars of the assault detachments called on the troops to hold their ground steadfastly and continue the advance, shooting the first guardsmen who turned back. In response, several commissars were killed by soldiers of the battered assault companies who hurried to find safety in the trenches. On the parapet, they found themselves clashing with the second wave of Krieg soldiers going on the attack. Hell broke loose as the advancing and retreating units mingled, filling the trenches with throngs of soldiers. Fights erupted as officers of the second wave attempted to clear a path forward. Within just a few hours, the 158th Regiment's assault completely fell apart. For this catastrophic failure and show of cowardice, the colonel, along with the staff, were arrested and ultimately executed. The regiment itself was subsequently disbanded by the commissars of the 88th Siege Army, and all surviving guardsmen were sentenced to join the penal legions. In other sectors, more progress was observed. The Krieg soldiers pressed the enemy hard, despite suffering heavy losses. In places where they reached enemy positions, the rebels' fortifications were captured in bayonet charges. Amid the chaos of bloody frontal assaults, the overall picture of the battle appeared unclear and fragmented. In some areas, regimental commanders reported successful advances, while elsewhere reports spoke of failure and massive losses. Despite this, the second wave of guardsmen was ordered to advance, once again flooding no man's land with rivers of soldiers. Grey ranks stretched all the way to the horizon. As the battle developed, it became evident that the enemy largely managed to hold their positions. Where the defensive lines were breached, the enemy simply fell back deeper into pre-prepared defensive echelons. The greatest success in the assault was achieved by the 34th Line Corps. The 291st Regiment managed to gain complete artillery superiority in its operational sector, destroying nearly all of the rebels' guns. Now the guardsmen broke through the traitors' front line and were advancing even at night. The siege army decided to capitalize on this success and exert maximum effort on this front the following day. The 11th Assault Corps, still held in reserve, was ordered to advance through the positions of the 291st Regiment. Soldiers began to climb onto tanks and crowd into gorgons. Preparation for the attack would take a day, meaning the 291st Regiment needed to consolidate its captured positions and await reinforcements on the third day. As always, the cost of the first day's assaults was very high, and many companies were already facing a shortage of manpower. The Loyalists who had captured the enemy fortifications needed to hold them until the arrival of fresh troops. The second day would become a day of entrenchment and defence against inevitable counterattacks. In reality, the gains were minor. The rebels defended resolutely and at times fanatically. However, the offensive needed to continue. Day 2. On the second day, consolidation of captured positions began, and uncoordinated attacks occurred as each company of Krieg soldiers entrenched or strove to accomplish objectives left unfinished from the previous day. Amid an artillery duel, the soldiers continued to engage in isolated skirmishes among improvised defensive positions. Here and there, a destroyed bunker was taken by Loyalists, only to revert to rebel hands after a counterattack. Cover was cleared of surviving enemies with bayonets and grenades. The occupied trenches were blocked on both sides to prevent heretics from penetrating inside. Heavy weaponry had to be brought in and set up to counteract the counterattacks. In Sector 50, Lieutenant Carter's men from the 8th Platoon of the 15th Company of the 158th Regiment found themselves in just such a situation. He had begun the assault as part of the second wave with a fully manned platoon of 60 guardsmen. After crossing the no-man's land under the traitors' fire, he was left with 33 men, who were now courageously holding the section of the trench. It was only captured when the lieutenant personally led an assault on the heavy bolter position, making his way through craters filled with wounded and dead from previous assaults, before leaping out and emptying the entire battery of his las pistol at close range into the weapon crew. Killing both gunners, Kader dashed to the bolter and, turning the weapon along the trench, shredded the enemy shooters to pieces. He then ordered the guardsmen, still taking cover on no man's land, to launch an attack, and the trench fell into Imperial hands. Now the lieutenant had only to hold firm. Nearby, artillery shells continued to explode. That same night, Carter's soldiers cleared out the bunker and erected barricades along the entire length of the captured section. At dawn, the heretics attempted to retake the trench by lobbing grenades over the barricades. The captured heavy bolter roared once more, driving the foes back. Each time the traitors appeared, bursts of fire, unleashed nearly point blank, forced the attackers to seek cover. By noon, the guardsmen were exhausted and running low on ammunition. Enemy mortar fire gradually drew closer. Urgently in need of reinforcements, the lieutenant and his aide ventured into no man's land to locate a Vox caster. Darting from crater to crater, he finally spotted the body of a Vox operator and removed the transmitter strapped to the dead man's back. Taking shelter in a pit, Kader called his commanding officer to report the situation but received no response. He attempted to reach the neighbouring company but once again heard nothing. At last, the lieutenant managed to connect with the commander of a battery of quad cannons, who agreed to relay information about his situation and location up the chain of command. While Kader was speaking on the communicator, he and his aide were targeted by an enemy sniper. The first shot struck the lieutenant's neck and was fatal. Kader collapsed into the mud at the bottom of the crater, his greatcoat rapidly soaking with blood. The aide managed to escape to the surface and hurried, still under sniper fire, to the trench to report the officer's death and the imminent arrival of reinforcements. By this time, mortar shells were already bursting on the very parapet, and most of the guardsmen had taken cover in the captured dugout, leaving a few unlucky sentries to monitor the enemy's actions. The situation was desperate. The 8th platoon had been reduced to 19 men. These brave guardsmen withstood 2 more attacks before the lieutenant's sacrifice was rewarded. From no man's land, a squadron of centaurs arrived, transporting squads of heavily armed grenadiers. Under the cover of heavy stubber fire, the troops leaped into the trench and immediately began expanding the captured beachhead, clearing adjacent trenches with grenades and flamethrowers. Soon the traitors retreated, and despite the prolonged mortar shelling, the trench was finally in the hands of the Loyalists. Under the cover of darkness, a new platoon replaced the 14 surviving soldiers from Carter's 8th platoon. On their way back to their trenches, the weary guardsmen located and retrieved the fallen commander's body. Small operations, akin to Lieutenant Carter's actions, continued on the second day across the entire front line, as the 88th Army sought to consolidate positions captured thanks to the previous day's sacrifices. By the day's end, several colonels demanded to halt or at least slow the pace of the advance. With such a level of attrition, their units would soon be nothing. The command of the 88th Siege Army and Lord Zwelker in particular were not inclined, could not, seriously consider such a request. The offensive was too significant to be cancelled solely due to the monstrous losses. For Zwelker, it would be the final roll of the dice, and a general offensive could not be delayed for a detailed analysis of the situation. The operational speed was decisive. The longer the final assaults were postponed, the more time the enemy had to strengthen positions, and the harder future offensives would become for the Imperium. No, the momentum of the attack, albeit small, was vital. On the third day, even more offensives were planned. The siege army was suffering, yet the enemy was experiencing no less hardship. Day 3. According to the order, battles continued along the entire front line, but the main efforts of the 88th Army today were concentrated in the southern sectors 51, 41 and 52, 41, where the 11th Assault Corps was preparing to begin the offensive. Soon, the noise and clatter of moving armoured vehicles resounded. Slowly traversing the shell-cratered wasteland of no man's land, the tank companies deployed into combat formations and went on the breakthrough. Huge Gorgons followed them, each carrying a platoon of 50 guardsmen ready to rush into battle at once. After previous counterattacks, the enemy now held a thin chain of shattered bunkers, walls and shelters. Soon these positions were captured when the Gorgons dropped their ramps and spewed forth hordes of Krieg soldiers. The forward fortifications could not withstand the overwhelming might of the 11th Assault Corps, and by mid-morning, tanks and infantry surged further. It seemed that a breakthrough capable of destabilizing the entire second line of defense was near. However, the commanders of the renegades were not blind to such obvious threats. They also assessed the danger of the breakthrough of the 291st Regiment and had the entire day at their disposal to rectify the situation in the sector. In executing a new counterattack, vehicles previously concealed in underground depots were dispatched to meet the 11th Assault Corps. The traitors deployed against the Loyalists Lehman Russes, Chimeras, new Basilisks, Medusas, and even 12 tank destroyers. As the vanguard of the Krieg soldiers methodically advanced, enemy resistance began to escalate. Tanks exchanged shots from a long distance while the destroyers lay in wait. Soon the landscape was littered with the burning, smoke-belching hulks of the Loyalists' stricken armoured vehicles. The rebels' counterattack achieved its intended effect, and by noon the guardsmen halted their advance, pressed by enemy armoured units. The losses in equipment mounted, and the soldiers urgently requested artillery support. The Imperial breakthrough stalled. It was yet another false dawn. Reports also came in from other sectors. On the very eastern edge of the offensive, the 3rd Siege Regiment of the 1st Line Corps finally reached the first day's objectives in Sector 62, 48. The unit was preparing for another powerful assault on the 4th day, with tank companies of the 14th Regiment advancing to provide support in the breakthrough. Day 4 and further. The small achievements and potential breakthroughs of the defence in the first 3 days could not simply be dismissed. It appeared the 88th Army was intent on crashing against the heretic second echelon. One colonel remarked that the High Command believed the best way to break the wall was to persistently bash one's head against it. In the crucible of battle, still raging in many sectors, the siege army seemed to be tiring faster than the heretics. The new regiments of the 46th Line Corps were battered in the engagements. As for the 469th Regiment, it fell almost to the last soldier, yet along with it, achieved significant progress. Now the entire might of the 88th Siege Army was set in motion, with the only reserves remaining being reorganized companies formed from soldiers who survived the first days of the attack. The battles on the new front did not die down for the next 3 days. Dust and acrid smoke now lay so close to the ground that visibility in some places did not exceed 100 meters. Under such conditions, it was impossible to coordinate actions or obtain accurate information about shell strikes. Nevertheless, the offensive continued. Perhaps this would be the campaign's end, one way or another, but one side had to break. As company commanders endeavored to fulfill their objectives, the initial momentum of the assault began to wane. The pace that had allowed the attack to advance so far weakened. Ammunition, particularly shells for the heavy artillery, was running low. Companies were reduced to the size of platoons, and platoons to squads. The offensive continued for 7 days, yet it was not possible to breach the enemy defences until, in the year 822 of the 41st millennium, the newly arrived 468th Regiment conducted its first attack in Sector 57-50. The commander of the 468th, Colonel Athos, devised a plan for a nighttime assault on the enemy's trench. Amidst the chaos of battle, he managed to convince the command of the necessity for a new coordinated assault instead of the disorganized skirmishes of previous days, which had led to minimal gains and significant losses in manpower and equipment. Colonel Athos gathered all his artillery to bring the plan to fruition and was able to secure additional ammunition from the stores of the 46th Line Corps. The concept was that under the cover of a prolonged nighttime bombardment, Athos would personally lead the vanguard of assault companies across no man's land, striving to approach the enemy positions as closely as possible. The artillery was to force the heretics to take cover, thus preventing them from detecting the guardsmen. The assault troops would then lie on no man's land until the first rays of dawn, when the batteries would concentrate fire on the enemy's forward lines. Then would come the plan's most crucial part. The bombardment would shift 50 meters forward, allowing the assault companies to cross the reduced distance to the heretic trenches before they could open return fire. Once the colonel captured the trenches, subsequent units would exploit the success. Initially, the command did not authorize the attack, citing the excessive risk and difficulty of managing large groups of men during night hours. However, Athos argued that with sufficient artillery fire concentration, the enemy's guns could be suppressed even in the event of a failed offensive, and the troops could be withdrawn with minimal losses. Athos's arguments ultimately convinced the command, and he received authorization for the attack. On a dark night in the year 822 of the 41st millennium, the assault companies led by the colonel left the trenches and began crawling across no man's land. All soldiers were required to maintain silence, move carefully, and avoid detection. As the soldiers crawled, the regimental guns, including those Athos had requisitioned from separate companies, unleashed a deafening salvo. Shells whistled over the heads of the Kriegsmen and crashed into the heretics' positions. Under the cover of the exploding shells, the guardsmen moved ever closer. The heavens lit up with the glare of 1,000 scorching guns, yet the rebels hid within their underground shelters. At the appointed time, the fire focused on the front line. The soldiers of Krieg lay waiting while the ground a mere 100 meters away from them was churned by hundreds of explosions. When the bombardment shifted forward, the colonel arose with a las pistol and a sword in his hands and ordered the attack. The soldiers sprang as one and surged forward. The element of surprise was absolute, and the enemy simply did not have enough time to react adequately. Before the heretics could climb out of their shelters, clusters of grenades were tossed inside. Seeing the enemy already among them, many took to flight. Athos ran along the trench, rallying soldiers to follow him, when suddenly he found himself face to face with a massive monster. Emerging from its trench, a furious, muscle-bound 3-meter ogrin struck the colonel with a huge maul. Athos's shattered body, with its crushed ribcage, was thrown 6 meters away. The frenzied creature charged through the hail of laser fire, carving a bloody path through the trench before a precise shot from a grenade launcher tore the creature to shreds. In one of the ruined bunkers, a stunned and shell-shocked enemy squad surrendered without a single shot. Despite the death of Colonel Attis, at dawn, the second wave continued the advance, passing over the positions captured by the assault force. By some miracle, they broke through. In front of the 468th Regiment, there were no more bunkers, fortifications, or trenches with barricades. The second echelon of the traitors' defence had been broken. News of the 468th Regiment's success swiftly reached the Supreme Command, and soon reinforcements poured in to exploit the breach. The first to arrive were the Centaurs, delivering a battery of quad launchers. The guns immediately joined the fray, their swift salvos crushing the last desperate attempts of the rebels to mount a counterattack. Even more troops arrived. Tanks, gorgons, heavy artillery, squadrons of Death Riders surged forward, then veered east and west to strike at the traitors' deep rear. As 8 years prior, during the first breakthrough, in the subsequent days, the enemy's defensive line collapsed like a house of cards. The dam was finally breached, and the Krieg forces surged into the breach like an unstoppable tide. The situation repeated itself as the heretics realized that maintaining their positions was now untenable, and they needed to salvage what they could before moving to the next echelon. Leaving behind suicide squads to delay the Imperials' advance, the enemy began their retreat. One by one, the siege regiments resumed their assault, in some places encountering no resistance at all. The distinguished 468th Regiment moved to capture the ruins of Hab Zone 2, where they were drawn into street fighting with the rebels. But units of the Imperial Guard to the right and left of the regiment were also breaking through to the south, and soon the ring around the Hab Zone closed. All traitors who did not flee the encirclement were slaughtered. However, as with the previous breakthrough, the Krieg soldiers were unable to immediately commence the assault on the inner defence line. The siege army was too exhausted and weakened to launch a new offensive against even more powerful fortifications. It needed time to replenish its losses and prepare for the next strike. New troops, new guns, and new tanks were required. The cost of the breakthrough had proven too high. The Imperium's forces were once again faced with the task of trench digging and constructing bunkers with supply depots. It took 9 grueling years of war to reach the current position. Years of bloodshed, slaughter and endless carnage, years of battles no less intense than the most nightmarish wars in the entire Imperium. Over 4 million guardsmen had already fallen on Vraks, but now, it seemed, final victory was within reach. The enemy was completely surrounded. The front lines had contracted even further, leading to an increased concentration of soldiers and artillery. And now the citadel of Vraks was within the firing range of the Earthshakers. For the first time ever, the key target was within shooting distance. Within the citadel itself, the leaders of the Vraxian rebels faced the prospect of defeat as the regiments of Krieg closed in on the fortress. However, Zafan seemed undisturbed by this situation. The apocalypse was almost at hand. The slaughter was to continue. Victory or defeat concerned him not, only death and destruction. By this time, Arcos had become an intimate and most valued advisor to His Eminence, and he informed the renegade cardinal that not all was lost. The armies of the false emperor might be tightening their noose, but in the universe there existed forces far more powerful than mere soldiers with rifles. The dark gods would be favourable to Zephan if he remained steadfast and continued his resistance. The Lord of Chaos told the cardinal that many allies were ready to come to his aid, and His Eminence only needed to know how to properly invoke their assistance. The gods could still lead Zephan to victory. Arcos gathered his sorcerer advisors. Here were those capable of bringing reinforcements to the Arsenal world. In secret, the Psychers began a bloody ritual that would summon the powers of the gods directly to Vraks. Reports of unusual phenomena began to trickle in from the Krieg sentries. Strange storm clouds were gathering. The horizon turned crimson from the fires burning in the sky, as if stained with blood. With each passing day, the storm grew in strength. The fierce lightning ceased to resemble a natural weather phenomenon of the world. Over the citadel, a massive dark storm gathered, an illuminated mass of red and black clouds, inexorably swirling into a colossal vortex. After 9 years, the Krieg guardsmen were on the brink of victory, but the warp-spawned storm heralded the arrival of even greater horrors.